A guy throws his dog along with his newborn puppies on the road, abandoning them forever, without knowing that very soon life would teach him a lesson. Antonio walked slowly down the cobblestone street in Oro Preto, the afternoon sun caressing his face. The air was impregnated with that fresh smell of wet earth that you only feel after a summer rain, and everything in the village seemed calm. But in Antonio's heart there was no tranquility. Despite the laughter of the boys playing ball in the square and the distant sound of birds flying in circles over the palm trees, he could only think of one thing: to get home and see Mel. Mel wasn't just her dog. For Antonio, she represented everything that was left of his life. A life that, although simple, had been happy. Each day, when she got home, she was there, with those eyes filled with a light so pure and authentic that even in the darkest moments she could get a smile out of her. His shiny brown fur, his cheerful heels, the way he wagged his tail when he saw it coming, everything about Mel spoke of unwavering devotion. Antonio used to think that without Mel his world would be a colder and lonelier place, and it was. When he opened the door of his little house and saw the dog running towards him, all the sadness he carried seemed to dissipate, even if for a moment. Playing the ball, watching her run tirelessly through the yard, listening to her gasps of emotion were small pleasures that kept her life afloat. But today, as he advanced along the street that took him home, Antonio felt a knot in his stomach, a restlessness that he could not explain. Something in the air, in the sky, or perhaps just in his heart, told him that this time things would not be the same as always. The echo of his footsteps resounded on the empty sidewalk, and with each step, the feeling that something was going to change grew more and more. He turned the corner, and there was his house, simple and cozy, with the old mango tree in the backyard, and the wooden fence he had built himself. From afar, he could see Mel sitting patiently in the doorway, waiting. His tail moved slowly, as if he knew that Antonio was close, but without the effusiveness of other times. It was as if she also felt that something was about to break. Anthony quickened his pace, eager to cross that distance that separated him from his faithful friend. But deep down, that same knot in his chest whispered that everything was about to change, that the happy days when Mel welcomed him with her unconditional joy were numbered, although he didn't know why. On that day, Antonio's world would begin to fall apart, and the only thing left for him would be the unwavering love of his dog, until even this became a painful memory. Antonio's days began to be tinged with an unforgiving gray, a color that did not fade, no matter how many hours passed. It all started with small frictions at home, phrases thrown to the wind that seemed harmless, but that left a subtle wound, like a knife that buries itself slowly. Isabella, his wife, had stopped looking him in the eye, seeking refuge in him, and each night the silence between them became heavier, like an invisible wall that separated them. The tension was rising. At first it was simple disagreements, arguments over unimportant things, but soon these small moments turned into sudden outbursts of pain and frustration. Antonio felt that every time he tried to get closer, the distance between them only increased. The love they once shared had become something fragile, which could unravel at the slightest touch. One night, the storm that had been brewing for months finally exploded. Screams filled the house, echoing off the walls and resounding in every empty corner. The words turned into sharp weapons and, no matter how hard Antonio tried to stop, it was too late. Isabella, her eyes hardened and her eyes full of tears, stared at him with a decision he couldn't avoid. "I'm leaving, Antonio," she whispered in a choked voice as she hurriedly picked up her things. He watched her, motionless, as if he couldn't believe what was happening, but he knew. I knew that night would not be like the others. He knew that the bang of the door at the end of the argument would be the last sound he would hear. Isabella left, and, with her, took the last drop of light that was in the house. The sound of the door slamming was the echo of a heart breaking, and Anthony stood there, in the middle of the room, not knowing how to fix what had just broken. The silence that followed was even more devastating than the screams. It was an emptiness that swallowed everything, a darkness that seeped into every corner, enveloping him in an unbearable loneliness. The days began to mix in, an endless succession of empty hours. Antonio sat in his favorite armchair, watching television without really seeing. Mel, his faithful companion, tried to get closer, wagging her tail gently, seeking his attention. But Anthony was trapped in his own grief and couldn't see past the sadness that enveloped him. Mel's playful barking, which had once brought him joy, now seemed only a painful reminder of all that he had lost. The backyard, which had previously been full of laughter and running, had become an empty and cold place. The little ball he used to throw to Mel lay forgotten in a corner. And as much as the dog continued to try to get closer, wagging her tail with that unshakable hope that only a dog can have, Antonio was no longer able to respond. He was trapped in an invisible cage of sadness and regret, unable to get out. Every time he looked at Mel, a pang of guilt crossed him. He knew he was failing the one creature that had always been by his side, but he didn't have the strength to change. Mel, on the other hand, did not understand. She didn't understand why Antonio didn't play with her anymore, why he didn't caress her or talk like she used to. She watched him from afar with those eyes full of unconditional love, waiting patiently, as if she knew that at any moment things would go back to the way they were before, but they didn't. Antonio's sadness consumed him more and more like a bottomless pit. The days grew darker and darker, and Mel, the only source of light he had left, began to become a reflection of all that he had lost. A weight, a constant reminder of her loneliness and her inability to recover what she once had. It was on one of these days, when sadness and anger were irremediably intertwined, that Antonio made an impulsive decision. With trembling hands and his heart crushed by the weight of his own suffering, he looked at Mel and her newborn puppies with a blank stare, devoid of the tenderness he had once had. He did not see them as his life companions, but as a burden he could no longer bear. In a desperate act, Antonio placed the puppies in an old cardboard box, their little bodies shivering with cold and uncertainty. Mel looked at him with her eyes filled with a mixture of anguish and confusion, as if she knew what was about to happen but could not stop it. Antonio could barely hold her gaze. His heart broke with every step he took, but in his mind the pain blinded him, clouding any trace of reason. With Mel and her puppies in the back seat of the car, Antonio drove to a distant stream, the same one where he used to go to think, to get lost in the sound of running water, but this time he wasn't looking for solace. When he stopped the car, he left without looking back and left the box on the edge of the stream. Every step away from Mel was like a punch to the chest, a silent scream of everything he couldn't express. Without the strength to face them one last time, Antonio got in the car and left, leaving behind not only Mel and her puppies, but also the last spark of love he had left in life. Night had fallen like a heavy veil over Antonio's life. The echo of silence in his home, empty and gloomy, resonated as a constant reminder of what he had lost. Since Isabella's departure, not only had her marriage disappeared, but any sense of normalcy seemed to have faded. What had once been routines filled with small moments of joy had now turned into an endless parade of empty hours. And, in the middle of all this, Mel and her cubs were still there, waiting. Antonio had reached a breaking point. His pain consumed him so much that he could no longer distinguish between sadness and anger. Every corner of his house seemed to scream at him everything he had failed at, everything he had lost. Mel, his loyal dog, was a living reminder of the happy days when Isabella was still by his side and the world made sense. But now, every time he looked at her, something inside him writhed. He no longer saw his faithful friend, but a shadow of what was once his life. Mel's newborn cubs moved around her with small groans of hunger and need. Antonio, with his heart hardened by pain, could not take it anymore. Everything seemed like an unbearable burden, and in his mind clouded by sadness, he came to believe that getting rid of it would be the only way to find relief, a moment of peace. That night, with the drink burning in his throat and clouding his judgment, he made a decision that would mark him forever. His breathing was heavy, ragged, and his hands trembled as he moved around the house. He looked for an old cardboard box, one of those that had already lost their firmness over time, and, one by one, began to put the puppies inside. The little ones moved, restless, unable to understand what was happening, as they emitted small cries that resonated in Antonio's heart like a distant echo, a deaf lament that he tried to ignore. Mel watched from a corner. Her large, dark eyes reflected an anguish that only she could feel. I knew something wasn't right. She knew, since Anthony had stopped paying attention to her, since his eyes no longer sparkled when he saw her. Now, as she watched him with his cubs in that box, Mel felt a deep despair. He approached slowly, wagging his tail in a gesture of supplication, trying somehow to change what was about to happen. Antonio, however, could not look at her. Every time his eyes met Mel's, he felt something break inside him. He knew that what he was doing was an act of betrayal, but the pain he carried in his chest clouded any other emotion. There was no more room for reason or for the love he had once felt for her. With the puppies in the box and Mel looking at him with those sad eyes that followed him everywhere, Antonio took the box to the car. The journey was silent, only interrupted by the small moans of the puppies and the sound of the engine in the darkness of the night. Every mile he traveled took him away not only from his home but also from himself. There was something about him that broke at every turn, at every stretch of road. It was as if he was leaving behind a part of his soul. When he arrived at the stream, the place that used to be his refuge on the darkest days, everything seemed shrouded in an unsettling calm. The water flowed gently, but the air was cold, as if the landscape itself knew what was about to happen. Antonio stopped the car and, without thinking twice, got out with the box in his hands. He hadn't looked at Mel all the way. He could not allow himself. His mind was in chaos, a whirlwind of emotions that dragged him into an abyss from which he knew he could not escape. He left the box on the edge of the stream, the old cardboard brushing the damp ground. The cubs moved inside, restless, seeking the warmth and security of their mother, while Mel watched from afar, motionless. Antonio's heart was beating out of rhythm, his breathing was agitated, but his mind was closed. He couldn't allow himself to feel, not at that moment. As he turned to get back to the car, Mel ran toward the box, sniffing frantically, trying to understand why her owner, her friend, was leaving them there. Her eyes, full of despair, sought Antonio's, but he did not look at her. He didn't have the courage. He got in the car and accelerated, leaving the scene as quickly as possible. Mel ran after the car, her paws hitting the damp ground hard, but her efforts were futile. Antonio was already far away, and with him had gone any vestige of the life they once shared. The dog stood there, panting with a broken heart, and the puppies trembling around her, unable to understand why she had been abandoned by the one she loved more than anything in the world. And so Antonio left, leaving everything behind. But what he didn't know at that moment was that, by leaving Mel and her cubs, he was also abandoning the last possibility of redemption, the last link with the unconditional love he had had in his life. Every kilometer that took him away from that place was one more step towards the abyss into which he was already falling. The morning sun was rising timidly, casting golden rays that infiltrated the leaves of the Atlantic forest. Eloisa, the village's healer, followed her usual path to the stream, where she collected medicinal herbs. Her walk was serene, almost silent, as if she felt a connection with each plant she touched. On this day, however, something different floated in the air. There was an eerie silence, interrupted only by the murmur of the water and a faint sound that seemed to come from further on. Eloisa stopped and sharpened her ear. It was a soft, wailing-like sound, the kind of soul-wrenching cry, even if it's barely audible. With careful steps, she followed the trail of that sound until, on the edge of the stream, her heart clenched at the scene she found. Next to an old, damp cardboard box, a dog with big, sad eyes was huddled together, surrounded by her trembling puppies. Eloisa's heart tightened at the sight of Mel. The dog, her eyes full of fear and pain, looked at her as if she was deciding if she could trust that strange figure approaching. There was a palpable vulnerability in his gaze, a mixture of despair and hope. Eloisa, understanding the suffering that emanated from that poor creature, knelt softly in front of him. "It's okay, little one. I'm here to help," she murmured in a soft voice that seemed to caress the air. Mel retreated slightly, protecting her cubs with her body, but something in Eloisa's energy calmed her down. Gradually, she allowed the healer to get closer. Eloisa took one of the smaller cubs, which was shivering from the cold, and held it with the care that is given to something fragile, as if it were a crystal that could break at any moment. This simple action seemed to break Mel's barrier of distrust. Without further resistance, she allowed Eloisa to collect the other puppies and carefully place them in a makeshift basket. "Come, little one, let's go home," whispered Eloisa, gently caressing Mel's back, who, dazed and confused, followed her with hesitant steps. As they walked towards Eloisa's house, the healer spoke to her in her comforting voice, saying that they were now safe. Mel, with her head bowed and her heart heavy with anguish, seemed to understand every word. Eloisa's small hut, surrounded by plants and full of life, became a welcoming refuge for the dog and her puppies, a place where, for the first time in days, they felt safe. Eloisa offered them food, fresh water, and warm blankets, and little by little the sparkle in Mel's eyes began to return. She had found something more than a refuge. He had found new hope. Meanwhile, in another corner of the village, Antonio's life continued its spiral descent. Since the day he abandoned Mel and her cubs, he had plunged into an even deeper darkness. He thought that by getting rid of them he would lighten the weight he carried on his chest, but what he didn't understand was that by abandoning them, he had also abandoned the last spark of love and redemption that was left in his life. Guilt haunted him. Each day Antonio wandered aimlessly, without a clear direction, like a shadow of what he once was. Her home, which had once been full of life with the presence of Mel and the cubs, was now an empty and mournful space, a silent tomb that reflected her own inner emptiness. He couldn't escape the image of Mel looking at him with those pleading eyes and the little puppies moaning in the box as he abandoned them at the edge of the stream. The nights were even worse. He would lie down and, in the silence of the early morning, he would hear his own thoughts lashing at him like relentless waves, reminding him of what he had done. Without work, without company, and consumed by sadness, Antonio began to frequent the streets of the center, drinking until the pain became more bearable, until the weight of his guilt seemed to dissolve in alcohol. But at dawn he always returned. The guilt always came back. One day, as he wandered aimlessly near the stream where he left Mel, fate caught up with him in a way he never expected. Anthony, dejected and weak, tripped over his own feet and fell between the stones of the stream, his body tired and his mind collapsed. He stood there on the ground, without the strength to stand up, as if the weight of his decisions had crushed him completely. The water of the stream flowed quietly, oblivious to his torment, and the cold wind cut through his skin. At that moment, Antonio felt as insignificant as a fallen leaf dragged by the current. It was there, in that state of complete defeat, that Eloisa found him. As she approached to gather herbs, she saw a figure lying among the rocks, and as she got closer, she recognized the broken man who lay there, covered in dirt and abandoned, as well as the puppies she had rescued days before. "Can you hear me?" she asked softly, kneeling beside him. Anthony could barely open his eyes, too weak to answer. Eloisa, with the same patience and compassion with which she had treated Mel, helped him to his feet, his heart moved by the state of this man who was clearly as lost as the dog she had found. She took him back to her home, offering him the same refuge she had given to Mel and her cubs. The days that followed were of recovery for Antonio, both physically and emotionally. Eloisa offered him hot food, soothing teas, and words of consolation that, at first, he could not hear. But over time, something began to change inside him. Mel's constant presence, who was watching him with those eyes that seemed to remember, began to stir something inside him. He knew that she recognized him, that she looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and pain. And he, every time their eyes met, felt a tightness in his throat. Finally, one afternoon, while Eloisa was preparing dinner, Antonio couldn't take it anymore. The weight of his guilt did not leave him alone. With a trembling voice and eyes full of tears, he confessed everything. He spoke of how he had abandoned Mel and her cubs, how the pain had blinded him to the point of betraying the only creature who loved him unconditionally. The words welled up from him like an overflowing river, and as he spoke, tears flowed freely down his face. Eloisa listened to him in silence, understanding the deep repentance in every word. Mel, who was watching, slowly approached. Antonio, waiting for her to move away, extended his trembling hand in her direction, but, to her surprise, Mel did not back down. Instead, she brought her snout close to Antonio's hand and licked it gently, in a gesture full of forgiveness. At that moment, Antonio collapsed in a deep cry that dragged on months of pain and guilt. He hugged Mel with the strength of someone who had lost everything and had somehow found it again. It was as if that simple gesture, that demonstration of Mel's unconditional love, was the key that loosened all the chains that kept him a prisoner of his own suffering. Eloisa, moved, watched the scene. He knew that Antonio still had a long way to go, but he also knew that forgiveness, both from Mel and himself, was the first step towards his redemption. The days at Eloisa's house were peaceful, wrapped in the calm and serenity that only nature and patience could give. Antonio, after confessing his dark secret, had begun to heal, but the wounds he carried inside had not yet fully healed. The weight of his guilt was still there, like a shadow that followed him at every turn. Despite being surrounded by an environment that breathed peace, Antonio felt that something inside him was still broken, a lost piece that he didn't know if he could recover. However, Mel's presence was constant. The dog, who was once abandoned, was now always close to him, watching with those deep eyes that seemed to understand everything without needing words. She didn't hold a grudge. For Mel, the past was nothing more than a distant echo. Her unconditional love, intact despite all that had happened, was a constant reminder that forgiveness was within reach for both of them. One afternoon, while Anthony was sitting in the backyard contemplating the horizon, without thinking about anything in particular, Mel approached. He saw her coming, her walk calm, her eyes attentive. She sat next to him without making a sound, simply standing there as she had always done. Anthony lowered his gaze to her and, for the first time in a long time, felt a genuine desire to get closer. He reached out with a softness that reflected the fragility of his heart and rested it on Mel's head. His fingers caressed her fur gently, and in that simple gesture, something inside him began to change. Mel raised her head and looked at him with those eyes full of kindness, her tail moving slowly in a sign of acceptance. There was no judgment in her eyes, just love pure and simple. Antonio felt a wave of emotion run through him and, for a moment, the knot he had been carrying for so long in his chest began to unravel. He had spent so much time trapped in his own grief that he had forgotten what it was like to be seen with love. And in those eyes of Mel, he saw not only forgiveness, but the possibility of starting over. Eloisa, who was watching the scene from the kitchen door, smiled to herself. He knew that forgiveness, true forgiveness, was not something that was given overnight. It was a process, a long and sometimes painful path. But he also knew that Antonio had taken his first step towards redemption. As he approached Mel, he was not only seeking her forgiveness, but his own. That same night, Eloisa decided it was time to talk. Sitting at the table, with a candle that softly illuminated the environment, she spoke to Antonio with the serenity that characterized his spirit. "The path to forgiveness begins with yourself," she said as she held a cup of hot tea in her hands. "What you did was wrong, and you know it, but we all make mistakes. The real challenge is learning to forgive yourself." Antonio listened to her in silence, his gaze downcast, his hands shaking slightly as he played with the rim of his cup. Eloisa's words resonated with him, but accepting that forgiveness, both from Mel and his own, still seemed to him an impossible mountain to climb. However, something inside him began to move. The wall of sadness that had surrounded him for so long was beginning to crack. "I saw you with Mel," Eloisa continued with a soft smile. "She has already forgiven you. She doesn't hold a grudge. She doesn't live in the past like we usually do. For her, all that matters is now, and right now, what she wants is to be with you." Antonio looked up, meeting Eloisa's eyes. The words of the healer were a balm for her wounded soul. He had never thought of forgiveness in that way. "I had always seen it as something that needed to be earned, something to suffer for in order to deserve it." But when he looked at Mel, who at that moment slept peacefully at his feet, he realized that perhaps forgiveness was not a battle, but a surrender, an acceptance of what we are, with our failures and successes. The days that followed were a slow but steady reconstruction. Antonio began to help Eloisa with her daily tasks. She learned how to take care of plants, how to prepare healing teas, and most importantly, how to take care of Mel and her puppies. At every moment, he felt that the emptiness in his heart was filling, not with grand gestures or revelations, but with small acts of kindness. Throwing the ball to Mel and seeing how she ran with that inexhaustible energy brought her memories of happier times, but also the certainty that those moments could return. Every time he played with the puppies, who ran happily through the yard, Antonio felt more complete. He taught the little ones to trust humans, to approach without fear, and in doing so, he felt that he was also teaching himself to trust again, to open himself up to the possibility that he deserved a second chance. One afternoon, while they were working in the garden, Eloisa approached Antonio and said to him, "You know, I've been thinking about something. I think we should share Mel's story, the puppies, and yours with the people. People need to hear about the power of forgiveness, about second chances. Perhaps by telling your story, you will help others find their way too." Antonio at first was reluctant. Sharing his shame, his guilt with others was something he had never considered. But she was right. Perhaps, by telling his story, he could finally release the weight that was still left on his shoulders. He could show others that no matter how deep the pit we fall into, there is always a way out if we have the courage to accept love and forgiveness. On the day of the event, in Eloisa's shop, the small community gathered to listen. Antonio, with Mel by his side, took a deep breath before starting to speak. The words that came out of his mouth were sincere, full of repentance and learning. He told how he had reached his lowest point, how desperation had led him to abandon Mel and her cubs, and how, thanks to Eloisa's patience and Mel's unconditional love, he had begun to find his way back. People listened in silence, moved by Antonio's honesty, and when he finished, a warm and sincere applause filled the store. But for Antonio, the true recognition was in Mel's eyes, which looked at him with the same unconditional love as always. She had forgiven. And now, finally, Antonio was also beginning to forgive himself. In that moment, he understood that the path to forgiveness was neither easy nor linear, but with love, patience, and the acceptance of our own failures, it is always possible. And with Mel by his side, Antonio knew that no matter what happened in the future, he would never lose sight of what really mattered. The days at Eloisa's house began to feel like a rebirth for Antonio. What had started as a temporary refuge for someone who had hit rock bottom turned into a place where he could rebuild himself piece by piece. The simple, meaningful daily routine gave Antonio something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Each morning he woke up early, went out into the backyard and watched the sun rise over the mountains, softly illuminating the leaves of the plants that Eloisa cared for with so much care. Antonio began his day by taking care of the same plants, watering them, eliminating the withered leaves, and helping the healer to harvest the herbs that would later be transformed into teas and natural remedies. The connection with the earth and the cycle of nature offered him a peace that he had not known for a long time. However, the most significant of her transformation was not in the plants or in the daily tasks, but in her relationship with Mel. The dog, who followed him faithfully at every step, had been his beacon during the darkest moments. Antonio realized that, although Mel's forgiveness was immediate, self-forgiveness was a path he still traveled. They spent hours together, with him throwing the ball and her running with that inexhaustible energy and joy, as if the pain of her past had never existed. Antonio watched Mel with admiration, seeing in her a life lesson that he could never have learned otherwise. As he watched her play with her puppies, teaching them how to run and have fun, he understood that love wasn't just what he had lost, but what he was building again from the beginning. With each passing day, Antonio felt that his heart became lighter. Where before there was only room for sadness and guilt, now hope began to flourish. It was not a dramatic or abrupt change, but a slow process, like the growth of the plants he tended to in the garden. It was a constant reminder that while the wounds of the past would never completely disappear, they could heal with time and proper love. One afternoon, while Antonio was teaching the puppies to trust humans, Eloisa approached him. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of tenderness and determination. "Anthony," she began, "I think the time has come for you to share your story with the community." Antonio looked at her, his heart racing. Although he had accepted his past and was beginning to forgive himself, the idea of telling his story openly, of exposing himself in front of others, filled him with fear. He didn't want to relive his shame or face the judgmental looks he feared he would receive. But Eloisa looked at him calmly and smiled at him. "People need to hear your story, Antonio, not only for what happened, but for what you achieved. Their transformation is an example of what love, forgiveness, and resilience can do to a person. There are others who, like you, feel lost, trapped in their own pain. Perhaps by sharing your experience, you will give them the inspiration to begin their own healing process." Antonio felt that those words reached deep into his heart. He still doubted, but he knew that Eloisa was right. Perhaps his story, with all its shadows and lights, could serve something greater than himself. Perhaps it was time to turn pain into a tool to heal not only your life, but also that of others. The day of the event arrived faster than Antonio expected. Eloisa's little herbal shop was full of people. The people of the village, curious to hear what Eloisa and her special guest had to share. Mel, always by his side, remained seated next to him with the calm and confidence that only a faithful dog can give. When Eloisa introduced Antonio, a buzz went through the hall. Many remembered him as the man who had lost everything, who had withdrawn from life and allowed himself to be consumed by his own pain. But now, when they saw him standing with Mel with his head held high and his gaze steady, they noticed something different about him. Antonio was no longer the shadow of his old self. He had risen from the ashes. With his voice trembling at first, but increasingly firm, Antonio began to tell his story. He spoke of his relationship with Mel, of how she had been his most loyal companion in the happy moments, and also in the darkest. He described the pain he felt when his marriage fell apart, and how that pain led him to make the biggest mistake of his life, abandoning Mel and her puppies. People listened in silence, some with tears in their eyes, as Anthony described how, blinded by grief and guilt, he had left the one creature who loved him unconditionally. But then, in a softer voice, he spoke of how Eloisa had found both him and Mel, and how that meeting had changed their lives forever. He shared his healing process, how he had learned to forgive himself through Mel's love and Eloisa's wisdom. Forgiveness, Anthony said as he looked out over the crowd, is not easy. It is not something that just happens, it is something that is built with time, with effort, and, above all, with love. I didn't deserve Mel's forgiveness, but she gave it to me, and thanks to that, today I'm here, trying to be a better version of myself. The store erupted in warm, heartfelt applause. Anthony felt the tears run down his face, but this time they were not tears of sadness, but of relief, of gratitude. He had come to the other side of his darkness, and had not done it alone. Mel, who was sitting next to him, stood up and looked at him with those eyes full of understanding and love. Anthony bent down and hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth of her body against his, a reminder of all that he had gained by accepting forgiveness. Eloisa, with a smile of satisfaction, took the floor at the end. Today we were witnesses to the transformative power of love and forgiveness. Anthony taught us that no matter how deep we fall, there is always an opportunity to get up. There is always a second chance if we are willing to open ourselves to forgiveness. The event ended with hugs, smiles, and many words of support from the community. Antonio felt that for the first time in a long time he was not alone. His story had touched hearts, and he knew that by sharing it, he had not only helped others, but also himself. From that day on, Eloisa's shop became a place not only to heal her body, but also her soul. People came not only for the herbs and teas, but to share their stories, to seek solace, and to remind themselves that there is always a new beginning, even when all seems lost. And so, the story of Antonio, Mel, and Eloisa became a symbol of hope for the entire village. A living lesson that love and forgiveness have the power to transform the deepest wounds into opportunities to be reborn. The days that followed the event in Eloisa's shop were filled with a new kind of light, one that shone not only on the faces of those who were present, but also on Antonio's heart. Although his story was marked by the shadow of past mistakes, he had found something far more valuable on that journey: forgiveness, both Mel's and his own. It was as if every step he took now was imbued with a deep gratitude for the second chance that life had given him. Mel, always by his side, remained his most faithful companion. But now, more than ever, Antonio understood the true gift she represented. Every time he stroked her fur, every time he saw her run with joy or nestle with her cubs, he felt that love was the most powerful force that could exist. That love had saved him, had rescued him from a darkness from which he thought he would never get out. Eloisa's small shop had been transformed into a space where people not only came to heal their bodies, but also their hearts. The story of Antonio and Mel, which at first was just an account of pain and loss, had become a symbol of hope for the entire community. People came to share their own stories of struggle, of forgiveness, of second chances. The cycle of love and redemption that began with Mel and Antonio had grown, touching the lives of those who listened and who also sought to heal their wounds. In the months that followed, Antonio found a peace he never thought possible. He learned to live in the present, not to carry the weight of the past or to fear the future. His bond with Mel and her cubs strengthened, and over time, these little beings grew up and found new homes full of love. But Mel, his unbreakable friend, stayed by his side, reminding him every day that forgiveness and true love have no limits. Eloisa, who had been the bridge between Antonio's broken past and his future full of possibilities, also found satisfaction in seeing how the community united around the stories of redemption and transformation. For her, each life she touched with her wisdom and kindness was a new mission accomplished, a way to give back to the world the love she herself had received. The story of Antonio, Mel, and Eloisa is not only a story of pain and loss, but a profound lesson in the power of unconditional love and forgiveness. It reminds us that no matter how far we think we've fallen, there's always an outstretched hand, an opportunity to start over. Sometimes that hand is that of a friend, sometimes that of a stranger, and other times it is the warm snout of a being who has never stopped loving us, even when we could not love ourselves. Antonio learned that forgiveness is a process, a journey that begins within ourselves and that requires patience, courage, and love. He learned that sometimes the first step to redemption is to accept that we deserve to be forgiven. And with each passing day, with each look of Mel, Antonio remembered that true love does not hold grudges, but always seeks to build, heal, and grow. I want to thank you for having accompanied Antonio and Mel on this very exciting and transformative journey. Stories like these remind us how fragile we are, but also how strong we can be when we lean on love and forgiveness. If this story has touched you, if it has somehow resonated in your heart, I hope you can take with you the most important lesson. It's never too late to look for a second chance. Thank you for listening, for being present, and for letting the story intertwine with your life, even for a moment. I invite you to continue to believe in the power of forgiveness, in unconditional love, and in the ability we all have to transform our lives, no matter how dark the past has been. If you liked this story and want to hear more tales full of emotion and hope, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give a like to this video, and share your opinion in the comments. Each story we share is a reflection of the struggles and triumphs we all face in life, and together we can remember that there is always a new opportunity waiting for us. Thank you so much for being a part of this story. May you always find the love and peace you deserve. See you next time.